as the essence that is self-consciousness, or the self-conscious being that is all truth and knows all reality as its own self, is, to begin with, only its notion in contrast to the actuality which it gives itself in the movement of its consciousness. And this notion is, as contrasted with the daylight of this explicit development, the night of its essence, as contrasted with the outer existence of its moments as independent shapes. It is the creative secret of its birth. This secret has its revelation within itself. For the existence of its moments has its necessity in this notion, because this notion is self-knowing spirit and therefore has in its essence the moment of being consciousness and of presenting itself objectively. This is the pure I which in its externalization has within itself as universal object the certainty of its own self, or in other words, this object is for the I the penetration of all thought and all reality. With paragraph 685, we now are going to approach one of the determinate shapes of consciousness, one of the Gestalten that we were talking so much in the previous paragraphs, both in the general introduction to the religion section, right? There's religion as such, and then it takes all these particular shapes in particular religions, and then in the previous paragraph, 684, that massive introduction to natural religion, Hegel said there's all these determinate aspects and each shape focuses on one of them. And so that's what we're actually getting to see more or less in its native habitat here in this paragraph and the three paragraphs that follow it. I do have to say something about the particular religion that Hegel has in mind here. And the place to start is with the translation that Miller has, God as light. When you look at what the German is, das Lichtwesen, it's not exactly God as light, it's rather essence as light, or the essence that is light. But we are talking about a configuration of the divine, so it does make sense to use the term God. And as it happens, Hegel does have in mind a particular, we can call it world religion, a religion that at one time had a much more significant following than it did in his time, than it does in the present, and that is the religion of Zoroastrianism, focused on the sort of living out a life that is in accordance with the truth, the Asha, as opposed to the Druj, and engaged with a god, the god, Ahura Mazda, or there's other names for it as well. And there's also an evil principle, which could be called Angra Mainyu, Ahriman. There's different names for it. Hegel's not going to actually use any of those here. But this is what is going on because, as we find out, when Hegel does lectures later on, his lectures on the philosophy of religion, a course which he repeated more than once, actually a number of times, this is, the religion of light is the religion of Zoroastrianism. He calls it the religion of the Parsis, which is technically half correct, right? Because the Parsis are Zoroastrians who fled Iran and wound up settling in India, and were called Parsis after Persians. But there are also worshippers in other places as well. So all of that's kind of interesting background. Why the light? Why is that so important? And why is Hegel associating Zoroastrianism with light? Again, if we go to the lectures on the philosophy of religion, what we do find is that Hegel is making a good attempt to wrap his head around this religion, but he's also got it within his sequence of religions. Interestingly, it's not the first one that he treats in talking about natural religion. It's actually the fourth. But here he places it first. There's clearly some development in his ideas and understanding as he goes along. he doesn't have a really solid view of it as is possible in the present for Westerners, but it's pretty decent at least, and we can see some elements of Zoroastrianism showing up. I want to remind you as well before we jump into this that just in the last paragraph, Hegel told us that there's all these different aspects in religion. There's higher and lower aspects, but some religions are going to take the lower aspects and make them higher and not really develop the higher aspects. So the way that Hegel views Zoroastrianism here, it's one of those, right? All of the natural religions are really doing that. Even when we get a little bit later on into the religion of the artificer, that it's still not going to be quite the same as what's coming later. So he tells us spirit as the essence, the Wesen, that is self-consciousness, or the self-conscious being that, now here's where we get to some interesting translation. I'm going to run through the text. That is all truth and knows all reality as its own self, is to begin with only its notion in contrast to the actuality, which it gives itself in the movement of its consciousness. So very typical Hegelian language there, very metaphysical, what's actually going on here. Before we jump into the what's going on, I have to point out something that when you go to the German text, you see that what Miller is translating as actuality is in fact the German term Realität, right? Which is a sort of Germanization of the Latin term Realitas. And what's corresponding to that usually? Wirklichkeit, right? And what Miller has translated in this passage as reality is Wirklichkeit. So Wirklichkeit is reality, Realität is actuality. It almost would have been better if he would have just said, Realität, reality, Wirklichkeit, actuality. It's not that big of a deal, but it might be helpful for some. So he tells us that the self-conscious being, that is all truth. This is a term he's going to use several times in here, and he's going to couple it with actuality or reality if we want to use either of these terms. So it knows all reality as its own self. This is, what he's been talking about for quite a long time. This is not actually going to be the phenomenological subject, but this is the subject of God, you could say. So, self-conscious spirit. Now he says it is to begin with only its notion, and once again, only its notion, only the notion in the raw, bare sense, in contrast to the actuality, the Realität, which it gives itself. Now that's another interesting term, right? And Hegel does use the word geben there, to give, to provide, to show to itself. We could even say in terms of the es gibt, right? It's there, right? So spirit is showing itself to itself in what it becomes, how it develops. And he goes on and he says, which gives itself in the movement, the Bewegung, right? What it's transiting, of its consciousness, Bewusstheit. Then he goes on and he tells us a little bit more about this notion. He says this notion is, as contrasted, Gegen, right, with the daylight, actually just Tag. But daylight is fine, right? The daylight of this explicit development. Explicit development is a little bit of a pleonasm. That means where you're saying a little bit more than you need to. Entfaltung, it just means unfolding, right? So, yes, explicit development, becoming explicit. I mean, explicit is very close to entfaltung because it's coming from the Latin terms of, unfolding as well. So that's not bad. Explicit development, they both kind of go along with that. So what the religion is doing and what the concept of God is doing in this is our explicit development. So the notion is contrasted as the night of its essence. He says, as contrasted with the outer existence of its moments as independent shapes. So we have independent shapes on this side, really a whole set of independent shapes in terms of beings, and then we have a secret that it's coming out of. Geheimnis. You can say mystery if you like. And that secret is going to, like he says, this is a creative secret of its birth. And then the secret, he says, this is really interesting, has its revelation, Offenbarung, right, within itself. So the secret, what is being hidden away, what is not visible, opens itself out, reveals itself to us. Very phenomenological language in this, isn't there? So he says it has its revelation within itself, for the existence of its moments has its necessity in this notion, because this notion is self-knowing spirit, and therefore has in its essence the moment of being consciousness and presenting itself objectively. The objectively there is it's presenting itself as an object for itself. So the reality that's being, or the actuality that's being produced here, that it's giving to itself, is how it is figuring itself to itself, right? This is not something really all that new with Hegel. We've seen this happen over and over again. Now we're seeing it happen in terms of religion. And so he says that this is the pure I, again, something we've seen before, which in its externalization has within itself as universal object the certainty of its own self. Now that's kind of a strange thing to say, isn't it? It has as its object itself. It's scrutinizing its own self. It's relating itself to itself. But what it has as its universal object is the certainty, Gewissheit, of its own self. So it can be secure. And this is, a beginning point, really, when we begin with certainty. And then he says, or in other words, this object is for the I, and we come back again to this, the penetration of all thought and all reality. So the penetration of that is being able to get to the bottom of it. All thought, including our thought, but also the thought of God, and all reality, all actuality. So this is priming us to move into the next paragraph. You notice there's not that much actually happening as such in this, other than, well, we've got a secret, and that secret, is showing itself, revealing itself to itself through how it unfolds. In the immediate first diremption of self-knowing absolute spirit, its shape has the determination which belongs to immediate consciousness or to sense certainty. Spirit beholds itself in the form of being, though not of the non-spiritual being that is filled with the contingent determinations of sensation, the being that belongs to sense certainty. On the contrary, it is being that is filled with spirit. It also includes the form which appeared in immediate self-consciousness, the form of Lord and Master over against the self-consciousness that retreats from its object. This being, which is filled with the notion of spirit, is then the shape of the simple relation of spirit to itself, or is the shape of shapelessness. In virtue of this determination, this shape is the pure, all-embracing and all-pervading essential light of sunrise, which preserves itself in its formless substantiality. Its otherness is the equally simple negative darkness. The movements of its own externalization, its creations in the unresisting element of its otherness, are torrents of light. In their simplicity, they are at the same time the genesis of its being for self and the return from the existence of its moments, streams of fire destructive of all structured form. The moment of difference, which it gives itself, does, it is true, proliferate unchecked in the substance of existence and shapes itself to the forms of nature. Yet the essential simplicity of its thought moves aimlessly about it without stability or intelligence, enlarges its bounds to the measureless, and its beauty, heightened to splendor, is dissolved in its sublimity. Paragraph 686 is the longest one in this short section, and it's arguably the one in which the most determinate stuff is happening, although maybe the last paragraph in it, there's also something worth pointing out in that respect as well. And so Hegel is telling us more about what he sees happening in this religion of light, corresponding to Zoroastrianism. And he tells us in the immediate first diremption, Entzweiung, right, splitting into two, of self-knowing, absolute spirit, its shape, its gestalt, has the determination which belongs to immediate consciousness or to sense certainty. So it almost sounds like we're going back to the very beginning of the work, and he tells us we've got, sense certainty happening here. And how is this the case? Well, it is immediate, right? And we're beginning with something really seemingly basic. He goes on and he says, spirit beholds itself in the form of being through this, sense certainty or immediate consciousness. And then he clarifies something really important here. So this is not as he calls it, non-spiritual being, non-geistige, that was the object of sense certainty. And think back to sense certainty, right? We see a tree, okay. A tree could be an object of worship for some people, but it can also just be, the stuff I'm seeing in front of my face, and I look around it, and eventually we get to the thing and its attributes. Okay, there is a spiritual aspect to that, but part of what was going on in the whole consciousness section was realizing that I, as the perceiving subject, I was putting all this stuff out into the world. And here what we're seeing is, no, there's something that is being grasped as immediate, but as essential, as divine. So he tells us that it is being that is filled with spirit. And then he also adds something else. He says it also includes the form which appeared in immediate self-consciousness, the form of Lord and Master. Now, Lord and Master is just two different ways of translating the same one single word, Herr, right? The master, the Lord, in the master-slave dialectic. And, you could say running through the rest of that whole section of self-consciousness, things are still in the shadow of the Lord as we're going through the things that follow after the master-slave dialectic. And so he tells us, the form of Lord and Master over against the self-consciousness that retreats from its object. And we could probably also read in there that, the Lord is also filled with spirit, or the Lord is spirit, right? And we're retreating from it. What is the Lord that we're talking about here? Well, if it's Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda, the bounteous, the wise Lord, right? The good Lord, the highest of the beings that are, the one who created the universe, along with, perhaps other beings, the absolutely good spirit. And, it's interesting. I mean, if you think about this, Hegel's not really, I think, picking up on this himself. But within Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda is a spirit. He's not a body. And so Hegel goes on and he says, this being which is filled with the notion of spirit is then the shape of the simple relation of spirit to itself. And here's where he says something really kind of interesting. The shape of shapelessness. So shape here is Gestalt, right? The Gestalt der Gestaltlosigkeit, the lack of having form. So the form of formlessness, the form of transcending form, the form of going beyond form, right? This is a possibility, it seems, inherent in the entire array of forms, that there could be a form that is not fixed, is not determined, but is rather formless. So that's quite important. What could that be like? Well, here's where he talks about light. He goes on and he says that the shape of shapelessness, right, form of formlessness. In virtue of this determination, what determination? The shapelessness. The shape is the pure, all-embracing, and all-pervading something, essential light, right? Lichtwesen, what we were talking about here in this entire section. This is the God. God as light is the Lichtwesen. So the essential light as the rising of the sun. I mean, it doesn't actually say sunrise. It's just talking about the east, but we could read that in there if we want to. The essential light of sunrise, which preserves itself in its formless substantiality. The notion of the sun as being central is not unique in any way to Zoroastrianism. We see this in many religions. We also see this in philosophies. Think about the role that the sun plays in allowing us to conceptualize the form of the good in Plato's Republic. Right? So there's really something there about the sun. For ancient people, it's the brightest light you're going to see, barring some sort of horrible natural catastrophe. So, and it gives light to everything. And it doesn't, there are shadows, of course, but shadows are cast because of sunlight. Now, here's something quite interesting that Hegel's going to point out. So this is a Wesen, right? This is an essence. This is a being. And then he goes on and he says, its otherness, what's the otherness to what? The light, is the equally simple negative darkness. Finsterness, right? Darkness, gloom, whatever we want to call it. It's an opposite to light. And there's really nothing interesting there. It's not an essence of itself, right? It's a pretty simple form of negation. And he goes on and he says, the movements of its own externalization, its creations in the unresisting element of its otherness. Now, what are we talking about here? The God of light are torrents of light, streams of light. In their simplicity, they are at the same time the genesis of its being for self. The term there is actually für sich werden, right? So it's becoming for itself is another way of translating that. In their simplicity, they are that, and the return from the existence of its moments. Streams of fire, destructive of all structured form, destructive of anything being fixed. Now, at the same time, as we saw, or said a little bit earlier, Ahura Mazda is the creator. And so there is a substance of existence, a Dasein, actually Substanz der Dasein, right? And this leads us to having forms, and he uses the word formen there, right? Not Gestalt, forms of nature. So the natural world, it shapes itself into that. But he says the essential simplicity of its thought, what's thought? The thought of the light God, moves aimlessly about it without stability or intelligence, enlarges its bounds to the measureless in its beauty, heightened to splendor, is dissolved in its sublimity. So what is Hegel saying here? Well, this is really great. It's something worth worshiping in some respect. Light, the sun, Ahura Mazda, a God who bats away or pushes away the darkness. But there's something for Hegel fundamentally lacking here. It's all very abstract. It could really extend itself to anything. He actually says something kind of like this in the, as I mentioned before, he's got a discussion of the Zoroastrian religion in his lectures on the history, or the philosophy of religion. And he tells us that, the Lord is good, but good doesn't really mean anything. So what we're missing here is any sort of real determinacy. And, right or wrong, Hegel is ascribing that to this kind or this stage of religion. The content developed by this pure being, or the activity of its perceiving, is therefore an essenceless byplay in this substance, which merely ascends without descending into its depths to become a subject, and through the self to consolidate its distinct moments. The determinations of this substance are only attributes which do not attain to self-subsistence, but remain merely names of the many-named One. This One is clothed with the manifold powers of existence and with the shapes of reality, as with an adornment that lacks a self. They are merely messengers, having no will of their own, messengers of its might, visions of its glory, voices in its praise. Paragraph 687 is very short and also relatively straightforward. It helps to have a little bit of background knowledge about Zoroastrianism to understand what Hegel is getting at in some of the things that he's saying in it, particularly about these attributes and then messengers. But you could probably read it without any great knowledge of that particular religion. And so he tells us that the content developed by this pure being, what is the pure being? The light essence, God, Ahura Mazda, right? Or the activity of its perceiving. And now notice he uses the term perceiving there. Just the previous paragraph, he talked about sense certainty. And sense certainty is the very first, part of consciousness. And then we have perception, Wahrnehmung. So we're making some progress through that. He tells us that it's an essenceless biplay in this substance which merely ascends. Now, what's wrong with ascending? Hegel's thinking that you need to descend into something that is going to be, you could say, challenging or requiring determinacy or some sort of process without descending into its depths to become a subject and through the self to consolidate its distinct moments, right? So there's something missing in development here. There's a foregoing and a jumping ahead and maintaining a kind of immediacy, or if you like, to use the concept that we brought in, formlessness, right? A lack of gestalt. And so he talks about the divine substance here, and that is the bounteous Lord, Ahura Mazda, if this is indeed supposed to be Zoroastrianism. So he tells us that the determinations, the ways in which this substance is determined, what we can know about it, right, are only attributes. And interestingly, he uses attributa here, again, taking it just directly from the Latin, it seems, which do not attain to self-subsistence, but remain merely names of a many-named One. So what are we talking about there? The attributes of God are merely names, merely titles, merely ways we can talk about God, a God that is one but has many names, and the attributes being just names and lacking any self-subsistence or any development means that they become kind of arbitrary. We can pick any one that we want, and it doesn't really matter. We could line them up in worship in some sort of litany, and a litany is a whole listing of essentially epithets or titles. It could also include particular prayers. Please do this. Please do this. Please do this. But it could also just be a listing of all these names. And some litanies, when you don't know what the names are supposed to signify, they're just a list of words. In a way, they're not quite names because they're not naming anything. They're just syllables. And Hegel is saying that this is a problem with this religion of light. And he says, this One is clothed with the manifold powers of existence and with the shapes of reality, as with an adornment that lacks a self. It didn't descend into the depths, so it doesn't get that self. They're merely, and here's where he says something really interesting, they're merely messengers. Now, messengers have a kind of agency, don't they? Aren't they beings on their own? All of these determinations that we have, they're merely messengers, Boten, right? And Hegel tells us, no, they don't really have any self-subsistence. They're really just reflections of the divine substance. And this reflects certain ways of understanding Zoroastrianism. For example, when all of the yazatas, or the beings worthy of worship, or the emeshespentas, the divine heptad, which you can call a certain kind of angel, are basically looked at as just emanations of the divine substance, right? Hegel talks about it that way. They have no will, right? Eigen des Willens entbehrende. They're deprived of their own will, right? And all they can do is communicate what the divine substance has. Power or might, Macht, visions of its glory, Anschauungen seiner Herrlichkeit. Herrlichkeit is glory. It's also the Lord. And then voices in its praise, Stimmen seines Preises. So if in this interpretation, at least, of Zoroastrianism, all of the emeshespentas or the yazatas, all of those divine beings that are, in a way, sort of like lowercase g gods, they're just reflections of the divine substance, and they don't really do anything in this scheme. However, this reeling, unconstrained life must determine itself as being for self and endow its vanishing shapes with an enduring subsistence. The immediate being, in which it stands in antithesis to its consciousness, is itself the negative power which dissolves its distinctions. It is thus, in truth, the self, and spirit therefore passes on to know itself in the form of self. Pure light disperses its unitary nature into an infinity of forms and offers itself up as a sacrifice to being for self, so that from its substance the individual may take an enduring existence for itself. Paragraph 688 is really a transitional paragraph. It's not actually telling us any more about this particular stage of religion that we began our study of natural religion with. God is light, or the light essence associated with Zoroastrianism for Hegel. Instead, he's preparing us for the transition into the discussion of plant and animal as ways of understanding the religious object or God. And so what's happening here in paragraph 688 is really not developing further any of the stuff that's been happening in the previous paragraphs in terms of the religion, but it is taking some of the motifs, some of the themes, and saying, all right, let's say that instead of, as in paragraph 687, instead of engaging in this merely ascending without descending into its depths, what if it does that? And so he says this reeling, unconstrained life, so that's one way of understanding it, life, which is spirit, which is also pure light, right, must determine itself as being for self. Now, usually when we think about being for self, we're thinking about a relation to the self. That's not exactly what's going to be happening here. There's going to be a sacrifice of its own being happening, and this life having being for self, life with a capital L, means that it gives to lives, to individual lives, living things, something of itself and loses something in the process. So he tells us that it must determine itself as being for self and thereby endow its vanishing, verschwindende, shapes, Gestalten, with an enduring subsistence, a bestehen, right, a remaining in place. So he tells us the immediate being in which it stands in antithesis to its consciousness is the negative power which dissolves its distinctions. That's not particularly helpful to know, except that the distinctions are, being dissolved into what? Into life. But then we're finding new distinctions happening. So he says, it is thus in truth the self, which is what we're looking for, And spirit passes on to know itself in the form of self. So what is religion? Spirit knowing itself. Here, the spirit that's knowing itself is going to know itself through the vanishing shapes, or, as he calls it a little bit later, an infinity of forms. Pure light disperses its unitary nature into an infinity of forms. And notice, these are not forms of light. These are robust plant and animal forms, living things. Life takes the form of life, onto infinity. Uppercase L, life, lowercase l, lives. But not in the plural, a whole bunch of individuals. So he calls this pure light offers itself up as a sacrifice to being for self. An Opfer in German, right? A sacrifice. So that from its substance, the individual may take an enduring existence for itself. And what is the individual at this point? We're not yet at like the individual, the human being. We're going to get there very quickly when we get to the artificer. But we're going to have the individual as the plant or animal in the next section. And we could also say as the religious believer associating himself with that. So we take God, in a certain respect, as light, at least, off the scene, and now we turn to this infinity of tangible forms that we can say maybe in some respect are God or shapes of God.